Boker Tov. This week we're
Welcome.
actually beginning the book of Vayikra, the third book of the Torah. And as I said, about a third of the book of Shemot really focus on the building of the Mishkan, all of the little parts of it, putting it together, and then actually establishing it, which is the way the book of Shemot ends. But Vayikra, called in English Leviticus, because it deals mostly or significantly with the laws of the Levites and the Kohanim, the priests in the Mishkan. So now you have the building built. What do you do in it? All of the offerings. And one of the interesting things about it is a lot of times, if you look at classical commentaries on the book of Leviticus of Vayikra, which is the first Hebrew word, and he called, between Moshe and Hashem, the commentaries are pretty. There's not a lot there. Even in last week's Parasha, if you were following along in like the Art Scroll Chumash, you could see there were very few commentaries. It was mostly just text, text, text. And you look at it and you say, well, that's because there's nothing really to say here. It's this many screws, this many bolts. You take this animal for this sacrifice, and there's nothing there. But what we will see, and I'll talk more about this on Shabbat, is that what rabbinic tradition has done throughout the generations is said, maybe the understanding of it is pretty simple. Like Rashi doesn't see any problems. This makes sense. You sacrifice this animal, but symbolically, there's so much more there. And some of my rabbis say that the sections on sacrifices and offerings are the most interesting of all because they seem so plain. It almost opens up the door for all the symbolic, metaphorical meaning. So that's what we'll be doing over the coming weeks and months as we go through Vayikra. But today, I wanted to focus not on the beginning of Vayikra, but actually on a special reading we'll be doing this Shabbat Zachor. So Shabbat Zachor, it's one of the 4 special parshiot leading up to Pesach, and it also has connections with Purim, because as we'll read in a moment, we are commanded to remember the evil nation of Amalek. And in Purim, Haman, the villain of the story, is considered to be a descendant, not considered, it's explicitly said to be a descendant of Amalek. But the question that I want to explore today are something about the language of these psukim, these verses, where it says that you should wipe out the memory of Amalek, but it also says, lo tishkach, you should not forget it. So how can you both remember something and forget something at the exact same time? So we're going to explore that. And then the other thing that's connected to it is an idea that we've explored in other ways is, what's so bad about Amalek? What was the bad thing that they did? And we'll find that those two answers are connected about what is the true evil of Amalek. So without further ado, Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would please read, so the portion that we will read, and it's a mitzvah to both read it and hear it on Shabbat for both men and women. This is not fulfilling the mitzvah, but from Dvarim. Tamar, if you would take, please, source number 1.
Okay. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. How he surprised you on the march and cutting down all the stragglers in your rear when you were famished and weary. He did not fear God. Therefore, when Adonai, your God, grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land, and Adonai, your God, is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a lot of, Eric, welcome, wonderful to have you today. And if you have questions, people are muted, it's just easier to do it that way, but if you have questions, just throw up your hand, either digitally or physically. But there's a couple of interesting things to point out here. One is the end that I mentioned, which is, it says in the Hebrew, if you look on the right, it says, Timche et Zachar Amalek. You should erase, blot out, wipe out the memory, the Zecher of Amalek. There's a debate about Zachar and Zecher, about which one to pronounce, but blot out the memory, erase the memory of Amalek, but then immediately mitachat shamayim, from heaven, like everywhere. And then it says lo tishkach. So it says wipe out the memory of that and don't forget it. So again, it seems like there's kind of a contradiction here. How can you both wipe out the memory and forget? And there's no one single answer, but the answer that I'll propose at the end of these sources is connected to one specific, also peculiar thing here. It talks about Amalek as a nation. Now, the word Amalek is the name of the nation. So it's a singular world. It doesn't say the Amalekites, the Amalekim, etc., like that. It uses the singular word. So when it talks about them having attacked us and taking advantage of us, it says in the Hebrew, Velo Yara Elohim. It says that he did not fear God, or had no awe, respect of God. Now, again, it seems like, oh, it's singular. In the Hebrew, it's a singular. So is it one person? So again, the simple answer is grammatically, the word Amalek, the name of a nation, is a single male word. But the other idea here is maybe it's talking about Amalek, but maybe at least metaphorically, it's talking about something else. So it doesn't just refer to this nation, something else is being hinted at here, but we will come back to that. So before we get into, yeah, Jane, I think you can just unmute yourself without me inviting you. Excellent. Yeah, go ahead, Jane,
is
please.
the controversy where it says Timcha and Zachor Amalek, because without vowels it could be Zachor Amalek, the male issue of Amalek?
Oh, interesting. So I wasn't going to, that's a modern issue, and a lot of people think it's nonsense anyway, because the Masorah, the tradition is quite clear on that. I'm talking more about earlier when it says Velo Yara Elohim, but you're asking about why people pronounce it both ways?
Well, I'm just saying, if you don't have dots, if you don't have the vowels there, you could read it that way, I guess. I mean, it's not exactly
like in Hebrew, there's a word that refers to a male, which is Zachor, and Nekeva, which is a female. So blot out the male of Amalek from under the heaven, and lo tishkach. So that's very interesting. Yeah, that could be one of the possible reads, but the tradition is quite clear that it's memory. And everything kind of goes from there. Specifically, the mitzvah about not forgetting and having to do with memory is that we read it, once a year. We actually read it twice a year. We read it this Shabbat, and then again on coming up. I think Jane, you're the only one unmuted on Purim. So if somebody misses the Shabbat, they can hear it again on Purim. So again, it's a very strong connection to Purim, which is coming next week, and connected to Haman, etc., like that. But yeah, that's a very interesting possible read there. And again, it might also, the idea that that will be proposed at the end by the sources that I'm going to bring in, that it's not just about the nation Amalek, it's hinting at something else. What you just proposed, Jane, could be kind of proof for that it's not just talking about this nation of Amalek and their memory. It might again be hinting at something greater. So before we get into those modern interpretations, yeah, Eric, you just have to click on mute on your side. I'll let you know when we can hear you.
Oh, thank you.
Go for it, Eric, please.
If I think I have a possibility for what Amalek could be a metaphor for, may I share it now? Or?
Yeah, I always love when people, there's a phrase in the yeshiva, Baruch Shekivanta, which is blessed are you who intended it, meaning you figured it out before you even read it. So go for it.
No, I got it. Well, maybe. I think it means despair.
Say more.
I mean, I know the stragglers were famished and weary, but they would be lost if they despaired. And you might despair if you didn't fear God. And by fear God, I'm not talking about the fear, but more like awe.
Yeah, so that actually, there's two sources, more like modernish sources, and one of them is going to focus on basically what the evil of Amalek is and the lack of that awe. So you're right on there. And then the other thing again that I'll talk about is how this contradiction between memory and forgetting. So Baruch Shekivanta, you indeed figured out one of the two most important things about Amalek, and more specifically lehavdil, to make a distinction between the weakness of Amalek and why they did these horrible things that unfortunately we'll see get quite horrible, and the strength of Israel. And other nations who indeed have that fear of God. So Yasher Koach, beautiful. In fact, Eric, if you want to stay unmuted, I'll have you read the next source. So this is not when we left Mitzrayim, when we left in slavery, and God had just freed us through miracles, and we were finally, for the first time in hundreds of years, a free people to celebrate with God, and people attacked us in the back. It's not the only time that we dealt with Amalek. There are several other times. So in the book of Shemot, so we read this a number of weeks ago, it talks about another very, very famous battle between the Jews and Amalek. So go ahead and you can read in the English, please, Eric, in source number 2.
Yeah, it better be English. Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, pick some men for us and go out and do battle with Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Then whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus, his hands remained steady until the sun set. And Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. Then Hashem said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it Adonai Nisi, which he said it means hand upon the throne of Yah. Hashem will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages.
Excellent. And by the way, the Adonai is when we read the four-letter name of God, we say Adonai, which just means our Lord or our God. But the actual name of the place would have been however one pronounces the letters, the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey. So we don't actually know the name of that place, but we know how it got its name. And here, there's so much powerful stuff going on here. Again, we see this phrase about wiping out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. It doesn't include the phrase do not forget, but clearly it's all connected. It's a consistent battle, hence why I call this, the Infinity War. This is an ongoing battle. But again, Eric, you had brought up the idea about what is the thing that Amalek lacks that Israel has. They have no, you had said it before, they have no fear, or the despair idea. They have no fear of God. And so the idea that we'll see in one of the sources is when Moshe's hands are up, it's not a magic spell. When his hands are up and he is strong, then the people believe that they're winning because not of Moshe, but because of God. So when they believe that God is there, they have awe of God, it gives them a certain strength. And Amalek is fighting for, as we'll see in the next source, we don't really know what they're fighting for because they don't really seem to have any values other than, murder, kill, and destruction. And yes, I'm oversimplifying. If we existed thousands of years ago, maybe there were more complex political things happening there, but certainly the vision and version of Amalek that we have through our history is of a depraved nation that just has no value system whatsoever, which leads to, again, much later in history in the book of Shmuel, in the times of King David, and Jane, I will unmute you for this one. The battle with Amalek, unfortunately, continues. So go ahead, Jane, source number 3.
By the time David and his men arrived in Ziklag, on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and against Ziklag. They had stormed Ziklag and burnt it down. They had taken the women in it captive, lowborn and highborn alike. They did not kill any, but carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the town and found it burned down and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive, David and the troops with him broke into tears until they had no strength left for weeping.
No, unfortunately, we have seen things like this, enemies that go in and just capture people and just take away men, women, children, but whether killing them or capturing them. We see this today, which is so painful. But again, this is what Amalek does. This is the Amalek of the Torah and the continued battle they have. Everything they do, from stabbing us in the back to kidnapping our women and children. And there's just, evil is the only possible word I can think of. And again, going back to what Eric said, or what he sort of started to hint at, why would a human being ever stoop this low? And what we're going to do is look at 2 different sources that are not only going to suggest why or how a human being could sink so low, but also there is no Amalek to speak of today. There is no evil like that anymore. So when we constantly remind ourselves of Amalek, what are we talking about? Do we always have to pick a new nation and look at a map and say the new Amalek is the Nazis, or the new Amalek is the leadership in Russia right now, or the new Amalek is North Korea? Is that what we constantly are doing? And once North Korea is gone, then we've wiped out their memory. But don't forget, a new Amalekite nation could come up again, like Haman. That is actually one possible read. But the next source we're going to see from an early Hasidic writer is going to take it in a slightly different direction. but he's also going to kind of get at the core of what was so evil about Amalek and how it connects to us personally. So Gloria and Leonard, going to go ahead and ask you to unmute. And then, so this writer, the Dushat Levi, written by Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, 18th century Poland. And again, he was one of the early Hasidic masters. You know, Hasidism, as we know it today, was still being formed, and he is one of the seminal early texts of what Hasidut, about that movement, is about. So he's very, very important and very beautiful writer. So Gloria, go ahead, please, source number 4.
Remember what, etc. You are famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. He did not fear God. It seems that it is not only for this that the seed of Israel is being commanded regarding the erasing of Amalek, which is from the seed of Esau. Rather, every person in Israel needs to erase the evil part that is concealed in one's heart, that is known by the name Amalek. This is because whenever the seed of Amalek is found in the world, it is found in the human being, since the human is a small world, and therefore there is a reality to Amalek, to the force of evil inside every human being, which arises every time to make a human being sin. And it is regarding this that the remembrance comes in the Torah.
Pause there for a moment. So what he's done is he went back to that where it says he did not fear God. Who is the he? Certainly it's Amalek, who's a descendant of Esau, who also became an enemy of our people. But ultimately, the he can also refer to each of us. And that kind of characteristic of being, godless, or just having no fear of God and just doing whatever you want, whatever makes sense. Going back to the days and the times before Noah, when people just stole, killed, whatever they want. And again, unfortunately, we have people like that in the world today. Far fewer than we think, by the way. I'll put that aside. The world is a much better place than it appears, but there are absolutely evil, depraved people, whether because their brains are literally broken and they're incapable of controlling their desires, or people have just developed, whether the Hitlers, the Hamans of the world, people are truly evil and they have internalized the characteristics of Amalek. So the he does indeed refer to one people, but it also refers to a characteristic that can come up in any of us, and in a small way. A good person can also do something that's totally selfish, where they just don't think about the other and they do whatever is good for them, from the smallest thing of cheating to cutting someone in line, which certainly is not so damaging, to obviously far, far, far worse. And this also kind of answers the question about the contradiction. When it says wipe out Amalek, but don't forget, one possible explanation is the Amalek that is to be wiped out, again, going back to Jane's thing, maybe it's not the memory of Amalek, maybe it's literally wipe out Amalek, kill all of the descendants, all of certainly the men of Amalek. But what's the thing that you should never forget is the Amalek that is inside of all of us. Now, again, that's not necessarily a literal, simple understanding of it. It's a metaphorical one, but it's a powerful way to make it both relevant and to explain some of the contradictions. Again, wipe out the actual nation of Amalek that are the descendants of Esau, but never forget that Amalek and everything it represents can never really go away. It can be in any one of us at any time, and we constantly need to be wiping that out. And what he's going to do now is talk about, certainly from a rabbinic perspective, what are some of the tools we have to overcome this evil that lurks in the heart of men. So go ahead, please, Gloria.
And behold, the strength of the seed of Israel is only found in the mouth, since the voice is the voice of Yaakov, found in the Torah study and in prayer. When a person has this force always burning within towards the Holy One of blessing, then no evil can control him. But when a person allows this force to rest, then immediately she or he is under the verse. And they left Rephidim, meaning their hands became weak, Rapha, and instantly an Amalek came. Instantly evil takes over. But when a person seizes in any instance the character trait of awe, meaning one is in awe of the Holy One of blessing and will not transgress God's commandments, in any instant, he won't come to sin. And this is why, quote, you were famished and weary, is written, that you did not have inside you the force of the seed of Israel, that their hands were weakened and did not serve God and did not fear God. And from this, you need to remember strongly so that the force of Amalek will not make you stumble. And this is why it is written, quote, and it was when Moses raised his hand. This means the force that is known by the name hand. When a person raises that force, and Israel prevailed. But when he allowed that force to rest, then, God forbid, and the other side prevailed, etc.
Excellent, thank you. So again, a lot of this is not a literal read, but it's a beautiful idea. So in Rephidim, when it says they went out of Rephidim, it was just probably the literal read is that they just left a location and Amalek went to war with them. But the word Rephidim in Hebrew could be, and this is, rabbinical midrash thing, Rapha, the word weakness, and Yadayim, their hands became weak. And the way that he's interpreting that, and I actually talked about this when we were in Shemot a while ago, is that it's not just literally Moshe's hands became weak, but what does it mean to have weak hands? Where does our strength come from? Our greatest strength comes from God. And when we are weak and weary, it means that we are not holding up, again, you're getting very metaphorical language here, somewhat poetic, but when we believe in God and let God be our strength, it's like we're lifting up our hands, almost like prayer. And that's what they actually say. There's a midrash that says, when Moshe's hands are up, he was praying towards God. He had fear and awe of God, and that gave him strength. When he wasn't praying, he had weak hands. So the hands become a symbol for the strength that we get from God. And then Kedushat Levi takes it even a little farther. It says, when we came out of Egypt, Mitzrayim, and we were weak and weary and famished. Now, again, the literal reading of it is because we had been beaten down for generations and we were just hungry. We had gone through the ringer. And even if you say the slaves were probably physically strong with muscles, fine, but we had been running all night. We hadn't had a chance to rest, to have a good meal. So that might be the literal thing. But the other explanation is maybe in that moment, our faith was faltering. And as we see, very soon after that in the Torah, we start questioning God. God, why did you send us out here? Is God really going to take care of us? So our faith was indeed tested. So in that moment of weakness, where we didn't say, God, we know you're with us at every second, that's when Amalek strikes. So again, on the one side, we have the literal. When does the people of Amalek, when did they strike us? When we were weak. And why were we weak? Because we weren't holding our hands up and calling on God's strength. So two, when is a person weak? When does a person do something bad, inappropriate, cheating on a spouse or on a test or stealing? When they are weak. And what makes them weak? Not connecting to God. If every time someone was going to go into a store and shoplift, they said, but God, what would you want me to do? If everybody did that, there would probably be a lot less shoplifting. But those are generally moments of weakness where they're not connecting in awe and fear to something greater. So again, in some ways, it's a very simple idea. When you're about to do something bad, look to God, and God will give you strength to make the right decision. So too with Amalek, when we're literally in war with them, what do we do to make sure we win the war? Turn to God. So it's both a beautiful idea, a simple idea. And while it may not be the literal meaning of the text, it's quite powerful and it connects to all of us. What do we need to remember? Not necessarily the people of Amalek, they're gone now, but that any moment, a new Amalek nation, not only can a new Amalek nation arise, as there are in the world, but any of us at any moment, no matter how good we are, we can do something bad. But if we always remember that we're humans and we can become weak, then we can constantly try and gain that strength from God through prayer, through Torah study. So the Kedushat Levi's idea, I think, is very relevant, universal, and can connect so many things. So before we go on to our last source, any questions up until now? Beautiful. So Leonard, I will have you take, please, this last source. So this is a contemporary rabbi. He's in Israel. He's written a number of books, Rabbi Francis Nataf, redeeming relevance. And I think he does it. I think he's done it for all the books of the Torah. And in many ways, he's going to kind of bring together everything we've been talking about. So Leonard, please, source number 5.
When the Torah tells us that the nation of Amalek did not fear God, It is said that they were unrestrained by any concept of a higher power, and thus possessed an unusual lack of common decency. They were the most extreme manifestation of this attitude. Their pirate-like behavior reflects a lack of respect for man's uniqueness and ultimately for the power that stands behind it. No wonder then that the Jews are commanded to blot out Amalek. They represent an antithesis to the Jewish nation's mission in the world, and their approach to life presents a formidable obstacle to the Jewish people's goal of establishing a kingdom of God on earth. The fight against Amalek does not end when the nation is destroyed, for even when it would be defeated, its legacy would likely remain. As long as greed exists in the human heart, there will always be a need to fight against the temptation to view others as mere objects, standing in the way of one's advancement. The eternal struggle against Amalek is how Judaism formalizes this need.
Excellent. Thank you, Leonard. So as you can see, in many ways, he kind of summarized, I read his piece, so a lot of what I said was based on his piece, kind of summarizes the idea that, yes, it's talking about an actual Amalek, but it's also talking about the characteristic of Amalek that can come up with us at any time. And I want to give you two examples that I think illustrate this well. The idea of Amalek, it's not that they don't care about anything. It's that the only thing they care about, Gloria and Leonard, not a trick question. What's the only thing Amalek cares about? The only thing they care about is
themselves.
Yeah, is Amalek. And in my class where I teach about the history of Israel, one of the biggest things we talk about is nationalism. Nationalism is the idea that a nation or state makes their top priority themselves. Now, that is not inherently evil. Certainly, if you're one person, a nation, you have something greater than yourself. The challenge or the danger comes when all you care about is your nation, to the point where other nations, they don't matter. They don't even count as nations, and you can just get up and go invade them at the drop of a hat, and you really don't care what you do. And again, we don't just have to point to today, what's going on in Russia, we can point through history. The Nazis, their nationalism was such an extreme form that they said, we want more land, we want more this, so they just took it. Now that's something a child might do. They want a toy, they just take it because the only thing that exists in their world is them. But now a more human and a less violent and extreme version of this is the other day, I was waiting curbside, pick up some tea, and I saw a guy who might be a lovely guy, and I'm not going to say he's Amalek. He was smoking a cigarette, which I don't think is a good thing in general, but when he was done with it, did he walk over to an ashtray or put it out on the ground, pick it up and put it in a trash can? No, what did he do? He threw it in the street. And I actually looked down and I saw that there were a bunch of other ones there. And in that moment, all he really cared about was himself. And I thought about, why wouldn't I just do that? Why don't I just throw my trash wherever I want, whatever is convenient for me? And what I realized, going back to what Rabbi Francis Tataf said about a higher power, is it's not just about the Torah and God. Here are the reasons why I wouldn't do it. My neighbors, if I throw trash, it's going to hurt my neighbors. Also Milwaukee, I love this beautiful city. I want to keep it that way. But also the Torah, I am a Jew. And I was actually giving a talk the other day about littering and how it's forbidden, and the Talmud goes about it and keeping your city beautiful and not making it a dangerous place with trash everywhere. So there are all of these concepts and ideas that are not about me, that are about the others, and I do it for them. When we do something bad and we do it only for ourselves out of purely selfish reasons, that's an Amalekite move. When we do something for others, we don't even just have to say it's a Jewish thing. Rabbi Nataf says that idea has been formalized in Judaism as don't be an Amalekite, but anybody who thinks about a greater power, whether it's God, your neighbor, the social contract, there's a lot of ideas and philosophers have thought about this, about, yeah, you could technically do whatever you want, but it hurts other people, and you can't have a society, you can't have civilization, and it's going to come around and bite you in the back. Again, what happened in the times of Noah and why God decided to reset the world. So yes, we do want to fight against physical Amalek, but the truth is, any of us, even if we're not bad people, can have those selfish moments, and that's an Amalekite moment. But if we ask ourselves and say, oh, I'm going to cheat on this test, and it's going to help me, but it's not going to hurt anyone else. Stop for just one extra second and say, will it? And if the answer is it really won't hurt anyone else, maybe it's not a bad thing. But if you think, you know what, if I cheat, it's going to be unfair because someone else who worked really hard won't get a chance to be a doctor or get this, whatever it is, they won't have the same chance because I cheated. And if I stop for 1 second and think about someone else, that is the exact opposite of Amalek. So it is both a real threat, an existential threat, and an internal threat. And while we have to wipe that threat out in any evil person in the world, we also can never forget that Amalek, both internally and externally, can happen at any moment.